instead of restricting access after a crisis begins. Major powers are now racing to secure future supply. Africa supplies many of the minerals needed for the global energy transition, and today the race is no longer just about who invests in mines, but about who controls the routes that move those resources. In that context, one detail is hard to miss. For 36 consecutive years, China's foreign minister has made Africa the first overseas destination of the year, a diplomatic tradition unmatched by any other major power. And this year, it's no exception for China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi, who you can see right now, holding hands with Ethiopian leader at the beginning of 2026, marking his first stop of the trip to Africa. Actually, China's engagement in Africa has been shaped by more than a decade since the Belt and Road Initiative, which our guests have briefly touched upon. Since 2013, Beijing has focused on financing and building large-scale infrastructure like ports, railways, roads, and energy projects, tying resource-rich regions more closely to global markets. The long-standing engagement now sits alongside two very different Western-backed projects, the Lobido Corridor and the proposed Liberty Corridor. The Lobido Corridor is an upgraded operational route linking Zambia and the DRC to Angola's Atlantic coast. While this map shows two very different approaches to securing mineral supply routes in West Africa. The blue line, you can see, traces the China-backed Trans-Guinea Railway, first agreed in the mid-2010s and formally advanced after 2019, linking the Simandou iron ore mine island directly to the port of Guinea's Atlantic coast, a classic mine-to-port model designed to lock in long-term access. While the red line, by contrast, marks the proposed Liberty Corridor backed by the U.S. and its partners, which will move iron ore from Guinea through Liberia to the coast and is still in the planning stage. So, Titus, 36 in a row, that must mean something for China, right, in terms of Africa's position and status.
Well, China has invested very heavily and strategically across African continent. It's mainly for, of course, the resources that China urgently need for its own development, but China claims that it is a win-win strategy. So it's not China that benefited hugely from all these development initiatives. African countries, and it's according to Beijing, the African societies and people also greatly benefit from these developmental initiatives.
Mm-hmm. You think so? It's also beneficial for the people in Africa. Can you help us understand your reasoning?
It's always debatable. What do you mean by African people and societies? Which classes, which sector of society will benefit the most from Chinese investments and development projects? It's always debatable, and it's always case-by-case scenario. In some cases, in some African countries, it also depends on the nature of politics and economic system of that specific African countries.
Okay, so Professor Guo, what's your take on this? If the corridors succeed, one of them is still under planning, right? If they do succeed, who benefit more? Is it the producer, the nation, or the foreign investors?
There are two major focal points of China's BRI. First one is Pakistan occupy more than a quarter of $1 trillion US dollars investment from Chinese BRI. The other is Africa as a whole. And I would say Africa as a whole has no leverage against China's BRI, meaning, first of all, Africa is too divided among the nations. Mm-hmm. And number two, Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, and along with all the huge investment, there's no competition at all, not from the States, not from Russia or from Europe. China alone dominate all the foreign investment.
But why the void of this foreign competition?
Because of natural resources, as you just mentioned. So I believe a highly divided Africa has no leverage over China's strategically intentional foreign investment to monopolize or the supply of natural resources from Africa.
So, Professor Ye, do you think it's safe to say that these different powers or major players in Africa are shaping this continent? Or also you can say that Africa has become, you talk about competition and cooperation happening at the same time in different parts of the world. Can you say that Africa has become a central arena also for this emerging form of resource imperialism?
It has been, but it wasn't really on the top of the consideration from the United States. So what we have seen is China has provided its investment toward African state through its Belt and Road Initiative, but we haven't really seen, aside from some dominations over natural resource extractions, America also have a huge investment in securing the specific rare earth mineral that's actually essential to U.S. industrial capacity. So, what's interesting is, of course, in the past, I think there's like a misinformation that's been circulating in the world where, China has been dominating all the investment in Africa. But that in part of the way is true because it's easier to actually receive Chinese investment. Initially, there's no string attached, so it's easier to use means of corruptions or other ways in order to actually get the money in and get the resource out. But for the U.S. investment in African state, it wasn't really. It was very more like a piece of here, piece of that, but it wasn't really in a very tiny amount. So I think if I remember, I haven't really checked the number of the global investment in Africa, but the United States is either around the level of Chinese investment in Africa or just a little bit short behind China, the total volume of investment from China.
But Professor Ye, you mentioned that maybe the amount of monetary value are quite the same, but I think the contrast is still very telling, right? Because when China's projects focus on like wider spanning of the Africa continent, while these two corridors are narrower, targeted, right? And one thing is that it's not monopoly. Even when it succeeds or finished, I think China or other producers can still use it, right? So what do you think from Washington's perspective in terms of building this infrastructure, or to be more precise, these corridors in Africa, in this continent?
In a way, Washington isn't really too interested in providing funding for building infrastructure in African state because there will be a numerous different questions or consequences that you may encounter. For example, so once the corridor being made and once the infrastructure being established, who's holding the control over those infrastructure? Theoretically, eventually you're going to return the management of infrastructure to the local state. But could a local government be capable enough and be clean enough in order to actually operate those facilities? That's always a question mark. And Chinese government, or from Chinese perspective, they're happy to actually manage it as long as possible. And if you couldn't really return the investment, they're happy to actually use a long-term rental or somehow just occupy it as long as possible because they're thinking about the strategic positions in Africa. But from an American standpoint, here's the puzzle. We want to generate investment, we want to generate return, but we don't want to manage it because we have so think about the war in Afghanistan and war in Iraq, where we try to break it apart and we try to let it run it, and eventually it becomes like American management. And if we just take ourselves back, then everything just collapses. We don't want that situation happen. We don't want to be dragged into a black hole again. So our mindset of investment is very different than Chinese mindset because for them, if it's a cost factor, they don't care as long as they hold it to themselves.
Okay, so my final question is that even if it doesn't mark a complete shift from globalization, but it's still focused on resources and preemptive control of its access, right? So what's the biggest single risk for Taiwan? We're not the country with the richest natural resources, right? So Professor Guo.
First of all, Taiwan's cutting edge number one is, of course, on semiconductor. It's almost monopolized. So it creates this situation of interdependence between the supply of rare earth element and also Taiwan semiconductor industry. And number two, Taiwan lies in the center of Occidental communication. So the situation basically does not worry Taiwan too much.
Hopefully. And Titus, what's your view on this?
I have a slightly different take on that. I think it's likely that superpowers on both ends of Pacific, they will seek to monopolize the access and exploitation of Taiwan's most valuable resources. That's our human capital and our semiconductor supply chain. It's not just one single company, but supply chain itself. And I think our strategic value might decline over time as more of such valuable resources are siphoned out of this island.